Stay curious, stay calm. Dawn arrives like a slow unwrapping. The sky above the city is still the gray of uncut wool. Gulls and crows argue over the river. A bell far off measures a market hour. You push open the wooden gate, and the world of the market breathes in your face. Steam from kettles, smoke from hearths, the sweet and sour tang of spilled ale, the salt of river fish, the warm starch of fresh-baked bread. Hands move quick and sure. Voices rise and fold. A child laughs. A woman whistles a short, precise song to keep count. Outside these gates, histories often reduce the guilds to men with keys and meeting halls. Inside, the truth is messier. The unseen labor of women fills the spaces between ledger lines. They are the fingers on the loom, the backs that lift barrels, the mouths that swear an oath in the market court. Their work is the daily muscle of urban life, necessary, routinized, and, because it is ordinary, easy for chroniclers to overlook. In the first light, they arrange their stalls. A dairywoman spreads cloth on a low table and lays out rounds of cheese, each stamped to show its maker. A seamstress unrolls bolts of worsted and linen. She runs her thumb along the weave to test its strength. An alewife widens the mouth of her pot and taps it with the back of a wooden spoon to judge the foam. Near the fishmongers, a woman in a greasy apron hauls buckets of river-caught herring, her hands already salty and stained. Much medieval production began in houses like these. Spinning was not an isolated chore but a household economy. Women carded, spun, and plied wool and flax in kitchens and communal rooms. Their rhythms matched childbearing, church festivals, and harvest labor. The cloth that reached a draper's stall was a product of networks, mothers, daughters, neighbors, whose names rarely, if ever, appeared in guild rolls. Guilds regulated quality, fixed prices, policed competition, and enforced social norms. Membership rules varied widely. In many towns, women could not hold full membership. In others, they acted through quoums or widows of members. In a few places, they obtained rights as masters. That patchwork forced many women into legal gray zones. Widows running workshops under their late husbands' names, daughters operating looms as unpaid apprentices, and itinerant vendors who sold dairy, poultry, or bread without formal sanction. Listen to the market's grammar, the soft clack of small coins, the rustle of parchment as a clerk marks a sale, a buyer bargaining for weight by the ounce. Women learn measures and prices with the same care as they learn to sew a seam or mend a pannier. Reputation mattered. A baker accused of short weight risked fines and public shaming. For a woman, reputation could be survival. Gossip was economic surveillance. There is intimacy to their knowledge. Midwives possess tactile expertise. How to feel a child's position, which herbs to brew, the exact moment to call for help. Fullers and dyers handle cloth in ways that are both chemical and bodily, beating wool with boots, soaking it in lye, whipping it under a wooden beam to coax the nap. Their hands smelled of alkali and oak galls. These skills do not sit comfortably in notarial ledgers, yet they determine whether a bolt of cloth will fetch a fair price. Seasonal rhythms shape everything. Market fairs swell cities in summer. Lent quiets certain trades. Harvest and shearing create surges in cloth production. Women plan births, apprenticeships, and large purchases around these cycles. They form mutual safety nets, shared spinning meetings, rotational childcare, informal credit, networks that function like a parallel guild, binding households by obligation and favor. Tensions flicker at the edges. Male artisans sometimes resented women's competition. Officials tightened rules during shortages. Moralists scolded women who traded boldly or crossed the city unescorted. Still, women negotiated these limits daily. Widows, especially, used marital status to claim economic authority. In many towns, a widow could continue a husband's business or take on apprentices, effectively acting as a master, while remaining socially sheltered by widowhood. Skill, more than statute, anchors their place. Eyes learn tiny deviations in thread. Fingers detect a weak knot. Lungs know when a dye vat needs skimming. Skill carries memory. Dye recipes passed from aunt to niece, a stitch pattern that marks a regional style, the exact timing to fold cloth so it dries without warping. This embodied knowledge travels in households, across lanes, and through seasons, unseen by municipal account books, yet essential to the market's life. Across towns, municipal institutions both constrained and recorded women's work in odd ways. Market courts fined offenders, but they also preserved lists of women who appeared as plaintiffs or witnesses, names that survive like light through a grate. In ports and river towns, women handled small-scale exports, barrels of salted fish, hanks of dyed yarn, negotiating with carters and factors. Their labor threaded the city to the countryside, dairy from nearby villages, fleeces from upland shepherds, garments folded for merchants' ledgers. As the sun climbs, the market quickens. Bolts are wrapped and carried, ledgers closed with neat scratches, coins exchanged with practiced hands. Yet many of the market's vital movements remain off the page. The attic where women spin by lamplight, the back room where a widow weighs barley for a neighbor on credit, the doorway where a midwife hurries to a labor. Those quiet places of labor will come into view in the next part, where thread meets wheel and the full story of textile work begins. You step into a low-ceilinged room where light comes through a high, narrow window and hits dust like soft flour. The air is warm with people and hearth. The scent is wool and wet linen, a faint sour of sourdough starter beyond the door, and an undercurrent of smoke. A mother sits near the hearth with a distaff under her left arm. Her daughter holds a spindle between two fingers and twists the thread as if pulling out breath. The motion is small, rhythmic, almost a private percussion. As spinning was the loom's first language, before a bolt of cloth reached a draper's stall, it began as a handful of raw fiber, fleece from upland sheep, the straw-like filaments of flax, or the odd imported silk, transformed by sequence and touch. The spinner teased lock by lock, removed vegetable matter with a wooden comb, and drew out a thin roving. With the free hand she drafted to the desired thickness, while the other turned the spindle, or fed the wheel. The newly formed yarn was tested by thumb and ear. A practiced spinner could hear an undertwist in the click of the spindle and correct it in a breath. Not all spinning looked the same. In earlier medieval households, hand spindles and distaffs were common, portable, inexpensive, taught to children. In later centuries, where records and art show them clearly, the spinning wheel increased output and changed a room's choreography. A treadle depressed, the wheel spun, and hands moved in concert. Whether spindle or wheel, speed did not replace care. A shorn fleece punished haste. Sloppy twist or insufficiently scoured fiber made cloth that shed or shortened underwear, and that failure could mean a loss at market. The work is sensory apprenticeship. To touch yarn is to read it. A twist too tight indicates brittleness. A limp thread warns of undertwists that will pill. A spinner's thumb is a standard, breath times a draw. In dim light, one learns to feel resistance rather than rely on sight. Children mimic rhythms, rolling a peg between palms until dexterity arrives. These small movements train muscle and memory in ways no ledger captures. Women's time was measured in threads and thresholds. Spinning fit around births and market days. It could pause for nursing, heating a pan, or answering a neighbor at the door. In households where cloth-making fed a family, spinning was wage work in miniature. Merchants or workshops sometimes advanced wool to families and later collected finished yarn or cloth, a proto-putting-out system that stitched household labor into broader trade networks and tied domestic rooms into regional commerce. Skill and law tangled. Some towns regulated who could sell yarn or cloth, and guilds tried to restrict access to parts of the textile trade. In practice, many women operated within tolerated margins. Widows could continue a husband's workshop, wives kept looms running while husbands managed accounts. Households used daughters as semi-paid helpers. Court records preserve disputes about short weight or quality, but they also preserve women's names. Fragmentary traces of labor otherwise invisible, moments when private skill crossed into public record. Picture a small spinning circle in a back room where 4 women work together. One winds yarn onto a reel while another soaks flax in a tub, fingers probing cold gray water to remove the outer bark. A third presses her foot on the treadle and watches the hearth. Steam from a kettle fogs the air and makes the wooden beam smell warm and sweet. The youngest fetches a candle to inspect a delicate skein by better light. Their conversation is practical. Dye bath temperature, how much ash to use for lye, whose flock offers the better fleece this season. Childcare interleaves with production. A cradle rests against the wall. A toddler plays with a stray ball of yarn, winding and unwinding it with ecstatic seriousness. Work and household are one woven life. Through these interactions, knowledge travels. Recipes for retting flax, the proportion of ash to water for soap, the trick of skimming a dye vat to keep color clean. These are practical chemistries, learned observation more than abstract theory. Time moves in cycles. A spinner's day can be long and repetitive. Dawn feedings, a morning of drafting and winding, a midday pause, an afternoon market run, evenings of spinning by hearth. Through seasons the workload shifts. Shearing brings preparation spikes. Harvest draws hands away. Lent and feast days alter demand. These cycles shape family decisions. Dowries might include finished cloths. Apprenticeships are timed to slack seasons. Marriages consider textile capacity. Skill confers subtle leverage. A woman who controls a reliable dye or knows to prevent a vat from souring can bargain for better terms. Reputation travels. A spinner known for even yarn earns repeat commissions. But much of this power is informal, based on trust, credit, and repeated exchange rather than sealed charters. Informality is resilient but fragile. Bad weather, a flock disease, or an epidemic could unravel months of labor. Spinning also carries ritual and social meaning. Women hum or sing to keep cadence. Certain stitches and thread colors signal regional identity. A mother's pattern may mark a family's cloth through generations. These cultural threads make the yarn more than commodity. They weave memory into commerce, and they help sustain a moral economy where favors, obligations, and stories pass hand to hand. As dusk approaches, the wheel's rhythm slows. Threads are tied off, skeins are washed and hung to dry in the yard. A basket of spun yarn is bundled for the merchant's morning call. The house exhales, but its quiet abundance can collide with public rules. When a town official inspects measures, when a guild tightens entry, when a factor's ledger shows a worrying balance. Those moments will test the small economies of the spinning house in ways that feel at once personal and public, a tension that will surface in the alewife's day to come. The brewhouse is a small heat island in the house. Steam rises in a steady column, wooden beams smell of smoke, and the floor is worn into a shallow groove where many feet have paced. You step closer, and the air fills with the round smell of malty grain and baking crust, the sharp green note of herbs, and a faint sourness that speaks of ongoing fermentation. An alewife moves between kettles with practiced steps, turning grain with a wooden paddle, judging temperature by touch, and by the way steam draws from her face. Her hands are rubbed raw in places, her apron dark with spent grain. This is not a glamorous room. It is necessary work made by necessary bodies. Ale and beer in the Middle Ages are not the same thing everywhere, and their language shifts by century and region. What matters for a market town is the house-brewed ale that moistens bread and softens hard work. Before hops became common in some regions, brewers used groot, local blends of rosemary, bog myrtle, yarrow, and other bittering herbs, to preserve and flavor the brew. Where hops have arrived, their bittering helped keep beer from spoiling, but that change happened unevenly across Europe. For the alewife, recipe and resources respond to the year's harvest, to whether a sack of barley was spared for brewing, and to the tastes of her customers. The process is elemental. Early in the morning, grain is crushed or soaked to produce a mash. The alewife watches as starch turns to sweet wort. She stirs with a long, paddled arm, skimming off foam and reading the color, remembering how a darker, thicker boil yields a sturdier brew for winter. The boiling pot sits above a steady fire, sparks smoking a blackened beam. The floor is a mosaic of straw, spilled grain, and the occasional husk of hops. At the right moment, she cools the wort in shallow vats, adds her herbs or hops, and waits while yeast, ambient and mysterious, begins its slow work. The next day, the ale is racked into casks or kept in open vessels for immediate sale. Women brewed by household necessity and by commerce. An alewife might brew for her family, sell pints at the door, and supply local laborers with breakfast ale, a common low-alcohol drink that was often safer than river water in crowded towns. Ale houses and taverns grew from these domestic economies. Many began as a woman's brew shop, where neighbors gathered to trade news, loans, and small favors. The alehouse is the public face of women's private labor. Here, the domestic brewhouse becomes a civic space, a place where work and talk weave into the town's social fabric. Regulation shapes the alewife's day as surely as the mash. Towns kept an eye on quantity and quality. Local ordinances, as well as the well-known assize of bread and ale, demanded fair measures and a standard of goodness. Appointed officers, often called ale conners, tested strength and taste, checked measures, and fined fraud. Market courts recorded complaints and fines. A sour batch, short measure, or immoderate price could land an alewife before civic officials. These inspections were both control and acknowledgement. They admitted that ale mattered enough to govern. Credit and reputation interlock. An alewife who trusted a regular might let a laborer drink on credit until payday. This informal tab kept households afloat, but also made women judges of character. They observed who worked steadily, who gambled wages away, who brought a family shame. That judgment was power thinly spread. It allowed an alewife to shape local life in small, practical ways. At the same time, it exposed her to risk. Unpaid tabs, the need to collect debts in the town court, or the social cost of accusing a neighbor. The brewhouse produces more than drink. It is a center of rumor, and rumors quieter economies. Merchants exchange news of river conditions. Women trade recipes for curing sour vats. A man asks after a relative's cough and learns who can lend a pair of boots, who can watch a child, who will bring a basket of barley on credit. In winters, when grain runs low, brewing changes. Weaker ale for more mouths, stretching grain with cheaper adjuncts, and increased tension when civic inspectors visit to verify weight and strength. When a single bad vat appears, panic moves fast. Neighbors call for advice, midwives fear contagion, and the alewife must decide whether to sell or to destroy. Brewing is not merely domestic drudgery, it is technique and memory. The alewife knows the subtle shift between a healthy ferment and one that will sour. She tastes and smells. She watches the foams rise and fall. These judgments are embodied expertise, skill taught by observation and practice rather than in a manual. A novice may overboil and scorch the wort. A practiced hand knows how the kettle's ring changes on the stave when sugars begin to caramelize. Those ears and fingers are the alewife's instruments. Her body is the living laboratory. Change gathers at the edges. Over the later Middle Ages and into the early modern period, brewing scaled up and urban brewing became more commercialized. Men increasingly entered market-scale brewing, and guilds formed around maltsters and brewers. Brewing moved from the house into larger brewhouses and inns. That shift reshaped gendered roles. Where household brewing once centered women's economies, larger-scale commercial brewing often excluded them. Still, at the door of the small alehouse and in the backroom kettle, women continued to shape everyday life. On a particular morning in late summer, the alewife's rhythm can be almost meditative, stirring, skimming, cooling, noting the weather and the bread's bake. But the same morning might conceal moments of danger. A municipal inspector's step on the lane, a messenger announcing a poor harvest in the hinterland, a neighbor's unpaid tab swelling into necessity. These pressures merge domestic craft into public trouble, the kind that will test a woman's standing in court and in the market alike. Tonight there will be a knock at the door that could shift her ledger and her reputation. A guild hall sits like a small fortress at the heart of urban life. Heavy doors, low windows, a stepped entrance worn by shoes, and inside a long table where men sign oaths and weigh contracts. From outside it looks formal and ordered. From within it moves the economy, rules, standards, fines, feasts, and the slow bureaucratic work that makes markets reliable. But those doors are not an absolute barrier. They are a threshold where public power and private life rub against one another, and through those rubs you can see how women's labor shaped, bent, and sometimes slipped around institutional forms. Guilds did many things. They trained apprentices, fixed measures, set rates, policed quality, and represented a trade before civic rulers. In doing so, they also drew lines of belonging. Membership conferred legal protections and economic opportunity. For many men, joining a guild was the path to independence. For women, the path was contested, uneven, and often indirect. One common route into guild authority was widowhood. When a master died, towns frequently allowed his widow to continue the business, running the shop, supervising apprentices, and collecting debts, at least for a time. Practically, municipal officials recognized that a widow who kept the workshop going served the town's interest in continuity of supply and revenue. The widow's continuity might be temporary until an heir came of age, or it might persist as a de facto mastership. This legal tolerance produced a paradox. Female practice could be consequential even when formal recognition was partial. Town courts are full of such examples, widows appearing with their late husband's seal, countersigning invoices, or taking apprentices to finish contracts. Marriage itself complicated guild membership. In many cities, the legal identity of a married woman was entwined with her husband's. contracts often required the husband's seal or signature, and women's property rights were constrained. Yet on the ground, many married women ran workshops, especially in cloth trades where work happened in the home. A tailor's wife might do hemming, a dyer's wife might tend vat and lathe, a fulling wife might supervise the great wooden hammers. Their labor was essential. Their legal invisibility did not erase their economic productivity. Separate from guild membership, women formed their own webs of organization. Confraternities, charitable guilds, and craft-focused associations created social space for women to organize around shared interests: prayer, burial rites, mutual aid, and, sometimes, economic coordination. Confraternities provided credit in hard seasons, organized dowries, and offered legal witnesses. Where formal craft guilds excluded them, women used these auxiliary institutions to build leverage, pooling small sums, guaranteeing a widow's continuance, or supporting apprenticeships within a household. Not all guilds excluded women. Some occupations associated with feminine labor, brewing, midwifery, laundering, and certain kinds of embroidery, allowed or even encouraged female authority. In ports and some textile towns, women were central to entire stages of production: spinning, seaming, mending, and finishing, where a craft required fine handwork, embroidery, for instance. Women sometimes dominated the trade, achieved reputations for excellence, and left traces in inventories and wills that attest to both skill and value. Apprenticeship systems also intersected awkwardly with gender. Apprentices were often boys bound for 7 years, but girls could and did receive practical training at home, informal, unregistered, and therefore off the official books. Some towns permitted the apprenticeship of girls for specific crafts, or allowed them to be bound as servants who learned a trade as part of household service. The absence of formal registration made these apprenticeships less secure legally, yet the skills passed on were real, and the social networks they generated could support a young woman's later economic life. Guild rules respond not only to craft needs, but to politics and social anxiety. In moments of scarcity or unrest, guilds tighten controls, sealing markets against outsiders, insisting on male-only membership, or prosecuting unlicensed sellers. Such measures often aimed at stabilizing prices and preventing fraud, but their effect could be to push women further into the margins or to criminalize what had been tolerated common practice. Conversely, in prosperous moments, guilds sometimes expanded networks, took on large contracts, and made room, practically if not formally, for a wider range of participants. Inside the hall, ritual matters. New members swore oaths, feasts celebrated saints' days and signaled alliances, ledgers recorded fines for short measure or bad dye. These rituals reinforced trust, essential in a world where cloth might travel for months between fleece and buyer. Women, when present, performed essential functions at the margins of such ritual. They prepared feasts, lent plate, sponsored masses, and sometimes financed parts of a guild's public work. Their material contributions, dowries, loans, household goods, helped sustain the very institutions that constrained them. There are also towns where rules were unexpectedly inclusive. In parts of Northern Europe, like the textile cities of Flanders, women appear far more prominently in production networks. Historical records from Bruges and Ghent show women as full participants in cloth finishing, as dealers in small-scale exports, and in some cases, as independent owners of capital goods like fulling stocks. In other commercial centers, urban women engaged in trade across borders, selling cloth, sponge-dyed linens, or finished garments to itinerant merchants, thus connecting household production to international exchange. Law and record-keeping yield paradoxical traces. Notarial archives, court rolls, and guild minutes are mail-coded documents that nevertheless preserve the names of women when they litigated, received dowries, or appeared as witnesses. These fragments allow historians to reassemble a more complex picture: a seamstress named in a will, a widow fined for selling without license, an alewife giving a loan, a midwife called to testify. The absences are as telling as the presences. Where records fall silent, the daily work did not stop. And yet the guild door remains symbolic. To pass through it meant access, to influence, to legal recourse, to the safety of collective enforcement. To be kept outside required agency elsewhere. Women built resilience by knitting domestic skills with social ties and small-scale finance, credit from neighbors, mutual help in childbirth, shared spinning sessions. practical economies that functioned as alternative institutions. As the hall's evening candles gutter and members sign a new apprenticeship, a dispute flares that will show the limits of both formal authority and informal practice. A tailor in the hall complains of a woman selling finished garments at the market for lower than the guild standard. The town's officers must decide, is this an economic offense to be punished, or evidence of a livelihood to be tolerated? The decision will ripple beyond a single stall. It will shape who may pass through doors and who must remain outside. The doorway to a widow's house is an index of many small sovereignties. A broom rested against the jamb, a ledger tucked beneath a stool, a child's clipped shadow at play. You step inside and the hearth's heat reaches you first. The same hearth that once warmed two people now bears the work of one who must both remember a life and remake it. Widows occupy a strange legal and social position, legally marked by loss, yet practically empowered by the continuity of household production. Their status is neither seamless protection nor simple vulnerability. It is a negotiated space where law, custom, obligation, and grit meet. In towns and cities across Europe, the death of a husband did not simply erase economic identity. It often created a window of legal permission. Municipal ordinances and civic pragmatism frequently recognized that sudden cessation of a business, an inn closed, a loom abandoned, a brewhouse silent, would hurt the community. For that reason, officials repeatedly tolerated or explicitly permitted widows to keep trading, to manage workshops, and to collect rents or debts owed to their late husbands. A widow could be the town's functional continuity. She fed apprentices, kept contracts, and ensured markets did not crumble overnight. Two overlapping financial institutions shaped a widow's security: dowry and dower. Dowry was the property a woman brought to marriage: land, money, textiles, often negotiated to support her household. Dower, or life interest rights, was what a widow could claim upon her husband's death. Sometimes a third of his lands or a portion of household goods, sometimes a right of residence or a share of income. The forms varied by region and by the legal fabric of a city. Ecclesiastical courts, manorial custom, or municipal ordinances all produced different remedies. Importantly, these rights were not mere abstractions. They were the difference between a woman's continued subsistence and forced dependence. But law is written for the ideal as much as for the real. In practice, the effectiveness of dower and dowry depended on many small contingencies: the goodwill of children, the pressure of creditors, the temperament of guilds, and the willingness of neighbors to honor informal credit. A widow might hold a life rent on a house, but if the property had debts, collectors would knock. If a husband had mortgaged his business to finance a long voyage, the widow might find her business seized by the merchant's factor. Conversely, a well-connected widow, one with kin, patronage, or the backing of a confraternity, could translate legal entitlements into long-term autonomy. Widows practiced legal literacy in a civic world that often demanded it. They negotiated with notaries, produced receipts, and represented themselves in market courts. Their signatures, seals, or marks appear, modest but persistent, in municipal roles: a woman assigning a lease, petitioning for the return of goods, swearing an inventory, or raising an apprenticeship. These traces are small triumphs of documentary survival. They tell of women who learned to use the law as a tool, not merely as an obstacle. Even illiterate widows could command legal mechanisms by hiring scribes, producing witnesses, and appealing to civic officials who had an interest in stable urban provision. Social customs buffered law in essential ways. Confraternities and guild-affiliated charities sometimes intervened to support a widow. Neighbors lent grain or took children into households for a season. These mutual aids were not sentimental. They were pragmatic investments in community reproduction. A widow who maintained a stable business supported many: an apprentice, a poor relief dependent, a baker supplying bread. So, towns had practical incentives to preserve widow-run enterprises. Yet this practical tolerance had limits. Economic crises, moral panic, or a vociferous male competitor could turn tolerance into prosecution. If a widow sold garments on market days at prices below guild-set rates, a master could press charges for undercutting. If debts mounted, creditors might petition to break a widow's lease or to have goods seized. Sometimes male relatives, fathers, brothers, or adult sons, moved to reclaim household assets, citing patriarchal norms or familial obligation. Widowhood could thus become a legal battlefield, where the lines between protection and dispossession blurred. Gendered stereotypes shaped outcomes. Authorities and neighbors watched widows with a mix of sympathy and suspicion. Sympathy for their loss, suspicion about their propriety or independence. A widow who moved too freely in town, traded after dark, or hosted too many guests risked gossip that could convert into legal action. Charges of unseemly behavior, breaches of curfew, or breaches of market ordinances. Reputation was a currency. Women conserved it like grain for winter, because rumor could be the first step toward a summons in court. But widows could also exercise remarkable entrepreneurial imagination. Freed from a husband's immediate control, some pivoted businesses, expanding their ale selling into an inn, turning a small sewing room into a full-scale workshop, or converting store space into lodging for travelers. In port towns, widows sometimes took over their late husband's agency work, collecting cargoes, negotiating with masters, and even advancing cloth to suppliers. Their work reshaped the economic map of a city because they did not merely continue, they adapted. The emotional dimension is never far from the legal. Grief and labor coexist. A widow's household may be the scene of both mourning rites and tight bookkeeping. A widow lights candles for a husband's soul in the chapel, and then counts threads for the next market. Memory lives in the objects she keeps, the husband's bench, the sealed chest of dowry cloth, and in the inventory she files to prove ownership. These inventories are intimate documents. They list not only goods, but also relationships. Who owes whom, which neighbor is owed a favor, which apprentice has been fed and clothed. Toward midday, the town bell rings for a court session. A widow tucks her ledger under her arm and walks to the hall. She must defend a debt, assert her dower, or answer a complaint from a guildmaster. The market watches, neighbors murmur, legal instruments will be tested, not the abstract paper of law, but the lived resilience of a woman whose future depends on a civic officer's ruling and on the slow arithmetic of favors and obligations. The judge opens the book. The widow's fate will hinge on the weight of one more recorded line. A bolt of cloth travels farther than most people imagine. It begins as a handful of fleece in a hillside enclosure, or as retted flax drying in a village yard, and over months it becomes a finished bolt folded into a merchant's chest, an entry in a coastal ledger, or a gown displayed in a city market. The cloth trade was a braided system made of households, spinners, fullers, dyers, packmen, factors, and merchants, and each stage added both value and risk. Women worked at nearly every knot in that braid, doing much of the finishing and retail work, even when municipal records emphasized merchants and guildmasters. The merchant is the face most archives show. He contracts for bales, advances coin, negotiates with shipmasters, and hires factors to manage goods at distant quays. Behind his ledger, however, are rooms and courtyards where women spin, seam, and finish cloth. In Flemish towns such as Bruges and Ghent, and in many English towns with textile industries, finishing operations, fulling, napping, cropping, and dyeing, relied heavily on female labor, performed together in households and in small workshops where women tended looms and vats alongside men. Transport shaped schedules and expectations across the network. River barges and pack horses collected fleeces from commons and brought them to town wharfs. Carts carried dyestuffs and tools between ports and inner yards. At the quay, a factor arranged warehousing, drew receipts, and advanced funds against a future sale, translating the physical arrival of a chest into a promise that could be kept or broken. Shipping introduced hazards, storms that delayed voyages, privateers that seized cargoes, and customs delays that held shipments in port, and each hazard increased the premium merchants paid and the uncertainty household producers had to absorb when they accepted raw materials on trust. Credit was the grease of this economy. The medieval cloth trade used a mix of informal advances and formal instruments, loans from neighbors, merchant notes kept by scribes, and increasingly bills of exchange when goods traveled long distances. Women accessed credit through social ties as often as through paperwork. A widow known to be reliable might receive wool on credit until she spun and sold a bolt. A dyer with a steady reputation might be advanced money by a factor to buy madder, woad, or imported indigo. These small-scale loans, frequently undocumented, sustained production between harvests and markets and allowed households to smooth seasonal fluctuations. Putting out systems linked rural labor to urban finishing. Masters or merchants supplied raw material to households and later collected finished yarn or semi-worked cloth. This decentralized model permitted expansion without large factories, but it also dispersed labor into private spaces where women's contributions were less likely to appear in guild registers. Household work adapted to family rhythms, nursing, harvesting, feast days, which made production resilient in the short term, but left women vulnerable when demand collapsed or creditors called in advances. Specialization at each stage added value. Fullers removed grease and tightened cloth by beating it in wooden stocks. Dyers tended hot vats that smelled strongly of urine, tannin, and plant tans. Finishers cropped and pressed nap to produce an even hand. Each operation carried hazards and tacit skill. Fulling demanded hard muscle and risked crushed toes. Dyeing exposed hands and lungs to mordants and powders. Finishing required a practiced eye for evenness that commanded higher prices. Where women mastered these arts, they exercised practical leverage, even when formal legal rights and guild membership were limited. International demand reshaped local life. English wool supplied many continental workshops. Flemish and English cloths were traded across the North Sea and into Mediterranean ports. Venetian and Genoese merchants specialized in luxury silks and imported costly dyestuffs, kermes, madder, and later indigo, so that a dyer in the Low Countries might rely on imports to achieve the bright reds and deep blues prized by elite customers. The Hanseatic League linked Baltic ports into a northern trade web that moved not only grain and timber, but also textiles and the inputs, tar, pitch, dyes, that made large-scale cloth production possible. Urban regulations attempted to mediate these pressures. Municipal authorities and guilds fixed measures, set quality standards, and in many regions regulated export points through the staple system, directing trade through checkpoints where customs could be levied and records kept. These mechanisms stabilized prices and protected consumers, but they also created choke points that could exclude small producers and raise costs for household-based labor, tightening the margins on which many families depended. Documents preserve a patchwork of evidence. Inventories list bolts of cloth beside kettles and spinning wheels. Port accounts record shipments handled by factors acting for absent merchants. Notarial rolls show widows pledging dowry cloth as collateral for loans. Court registers preserve disputes over short weight, contaminated dye baths, or unpaid advances. Taken together, these fragments let us reconstruct not only the economics, but the everyday textures of trade. The smell of vats, the weight of skeins, the creak of carts at first light. The geography of labor is complicated and gendered. Men concentrated in capital-intensive stages, long-distance contracting, credit mobilization, and shipping, while women clustered in finishing stages, local retail, and household processing. That division did not make women's labor marginal. The added margin from washing, dyeing, and finishing multiplied the value of raw material. A well-finished bolt could command many times the price of raw fleece. In that multiplication, women's hands created the surplus that sustained households, paid apprentices, and kept neighborhood economies moving. When a chest is opened at market, buyers fan the cloth and eyes travel over color, finish, and seam. Women in the crowd look for telltale signs: an uneven nap, a poorly sewn selvage, a slack thread in the weave. Those small flaws decide sale and price, and they reveal the human chain of labor and credit, baby's credit that ties a harbor ledger to a mother's hearth. A single unpaid advance, a seized shipment, or a contaminated dye vat can ripple through that chain. In the next part, we will follow the fragile arithmetic of small loans and the social practices that kept households afloat. The sound of credit in a town is not the clink of a bank vault, but the soft rustle of a folded receipt, the quick scraping of a notary's quill, the careful placement of a pawned brooch into a wooden box. Credit is social as much as it is monetary. It is trust written down, witness signed, and sealed with a hand. For many women, the ability to translate a basket of spun yarn, a chest of dowry cloth, or the promise of next week's wages into immediate buying power was the difference between feeding a household and falling into want. Household credit begins small and local. A neighbor advances a few loaves of bread until market day. A baker lets a seamstress take a bolt of cloth on trust because she will be paid after a sale. An alewife records a tab with a charcoal mark on a mugboard. These exchanges function like microloans, informal, trust-based, flexible. They rely on repeated contact and reputation. When repayment is late, The consequence is social pressure, reduced credit, gossip, or the withdrawal of favors, more painful than a formal fine. For women whose work fragmented across household and market, this relational credit is indispensable. Formal small loans take other shapes. Notaries recorded pledges and receipts in municipal registers. A woman might bring an inventory to a notary who then recorded her pledge of goods as collateral. These notarial acts mattered because they created documentary evidence that municipal officers and creditors could consult. For larger sums, factors and merchants issued written advances against future production. A dyer might receive a sack of madder on the condition she deliver dyed cloth, and the merchant's entry in his ledger functioned as both contract and moral suasion. Pawn and pledge systems provided a tangible route to cash. A woman could pledge household plate, a ring, or a bundle of cloth to a pawnbroker or to a municipal chest. The item was held as security. A written note specified the terms. Pawnbroking was regulated in many towns. Inventories listed pledged items, fees were recorded, and a public registry sometimes displayed unredeemed goods. These public displays had a double effect, providing temporary relief while also rendering private need visible to the neighborhood's eyes. Religious and civic institutions also shaped credit. Church prohibitions on usury forced lenders, borrowers, and civic authorities into creative arrangements. Credit was often mediated through bills of exchange, partnerships, or contractual sharing of profits rather than explicit interest. In some Italian cities, institutions such as charitable loan banks, aimed at limiting usurious practices, offered small loans against pledges. Confraternities and guild-affiliated charities occasionally advanced funds for dowries or to support apprenticeships, effectively pooling risk across a religious or occupational community. For women, these organizations could be both shield and lever, helping finance a marriage or to restart a workshop after loss. Women also acted as small lenders. An industrious widow, sitting on the yield of careful thrift, might advance coin to neighbors against future labor or against a promise of cloth. These mini-lenders depended on social knowledge, who worked reliably, who had kin to enforce repayment, who possessed goods with easy resale value. In this role, women both extended and absorbed financial risk. Their decisions knit the local economy together. Credit carried legal instruments. A typical transaction might produce a chirograph or a notarial note, the borrower's mark, a description of collateral, names of witnesses, and a repayment deadline. Such documents converted personal trust into public enforceability. If repayment failed, the creditor could appeal to municipal courts. Court rolls preserve many such conflicts, details of seized garments, lists of pledged jewelry, and the judge's orders. These records show how small claims could escalate into legal actions that altered households. Gender inflected both access and exposure. Women's access to formal credit depended on legal identity and social position. Married women's legal capacity was often limited. They required husbandly assent or used his name. Widows, conversely, were frequently the most credit-accessible women because they could hold property in their own right and thus pledge it. Daughters and unmarried women relied on family or confraternity support. Yet, even where formal restrictions existed, practical arrangements, husbands or brothers acting as guarantors, notaries recording a wife's separate property, enabled women to participate in credit networks. Risk was constant. Small loans smoothed seasonality, but could accumulate into unpayable burdens. A failed dye vat, a delayed shipment, or a poor harvest could leave a woman unable to redeem pledged goods. Creditors could move from civil requests to seizure. A municipal officer might impound a chest of cloth. A pawnbroker might sell an unredeemed ring at auction, or neighbors might withdraw their lines of trust. For households balanced on the knife edge of small margins, these outcomes were catastrophic. Yet the everyday practice of credit produced creative workarounds. Payment in kind, grain, labor, or services, substituted for coin when it was scarce. Reciprocal obligations, help during childbirth in return for later labor, served as informal insurance. Women used dowries not only as marriage wealth, but also as mobile capital. A piece of cloth could be pledged, a sealed chest loaded onto a cart, and the funds used to buy seed or pay an apprentice. Thus, parental planning, marriage customs, and market needs intertwined to generate a fluid, adaptive economic culture. Credit also shaped social hierarchy. Those able to lend accumulated discretionary power, sponsoring apprentices, funding weddings, or influencing market access. Conversely, indebted households faced social curtailments, fewer options for marriage alliances, vulnerability to market sanctions, and limited capacity to take entrepreneurial risks. Women navigated this landscape through networks, confraternities, neighborly bonds, and the quiet diplomacy of favors and witness signatures. In late afternoon, a woman pins a folded paper to her door, a notary's summons. A creditor, impatient after a string of bad harvests, has brought the claim forward. The quiet rhythms of household accounting break into public procedure. A bailiff's knock may come at dawn, goods could be inventoried and removed. The economy's small credits, once private solutions, can thus become public spectacles that expose the fragile arithmetic of survival. You step through a low-arched lane and the market reorients itself around smell. There is no single scent but a crowded chorus: roasting fat, a simmering pot of pottage, the sharp tang of salted herring, the warm, yeasty lift of fresh loaves, the grassy sweetness of newly churned butter. Heat blooms from hearths and braziers. Smoke hangs in low curtains. A woman lifts a wooden lid and breathes in steam. She judges salt by scent, doneness by the way steam darkens the beam above the pot. Food is the town's first public technology, and the women who make it are both engineers and caretakers. Medieval kitchens are many things at once: family heart, workshop, small manufactory. In a prosperous household, a separate kitchen might roast joints, stew, brew, and bake. In humbler homes, the same hearth that cooks children's gruel also dries herbs, scours wool, and boils soap. Some towns maintain communal ovens. Baking required a fuel source and an oven's heat, and municipal ovens turned labor into a regulated public service. Bakers' guilds regulated loaves, set prices, and demanded that bread conform to the assize. Yet household baking remained common, and women carried the daily responsibility of feeding kin, even where a professional baker supplied the better heeled. Street food is practical and inventive. The pie woman, often called a pie wife in English records, sells hand pies filled with meat, offal, or stewed vegetables, portable, warm, and cheap. She tucks them into a cloth and keeps them warm by the brazier at her stall. Pottage, an ambiguous, ubiquitous soup of grains, vegetables, pulses, and sometimes small scraps of meat, constitutes the everyday meal for many. Its recipe shifts with season and purse. In autumn, the pot thickens with beans and root vegetables. In late spring, it brightens with nettles, leek, and young greens. For many urban households, pottage is the point where market, garden, and domestic thrift meet. Fishwives are a constant presence in ports and river towns. They carry baskets of herring and cod, stacked on straw, the fish still slick and cold. Their voices are loud, shaped by hauling and bargaining. They know which day the boats arrived, which bay produced the best catch, and which merchant can be trusted to salt a herring well. Salt curing and smoking are technologies of preservation that allow fish to travel inland. These processes also create distinct market niches: fresh fish for the near market, salted for long-distance sale, smoked for winter stores. Dairy work balances poetry and chemistry. Cheese and butter are household outputs shaped by milking rhythms and seasonality. Women skim milk by hand, churn by rhythm, test curd with a finger for the right break, and wrap finished cheeses in cloth. In many towns, cheesewives sell from stalls or carry a wheel on a yoke. Dairy's fragility, heat, bad water, poor salting make skill decisive. A competent cheesemaker extends a family's horizon. A failed batch draws scorn and economic loss. Kitchens are also sites of preservation. Salting, smoking, drying, and pickling turn ephemeral harvests into winter insurance. An alewife's vats sit near a kitchen. A household that keeps salt and smoke knows how to stretch summer into hunger months. These methods connect market towns to hinterlands. The shepherd's lamb becomes a salted joint. The market's surplus vegetables become vinegar-preserved provisions. Women operate these technologies in both intimate and public registers, from the private larder to the stall where pickled onions glint in a wooden tub. Regulation haunts the kitchen door. Municipal ordinances set weight and price for bread, fixed measures for ale, and inspection for fish and butchers. Market courts prosecuted short weights and adulteration. An inspector could test loaves by slicing and measuring, or taste beer for strength. Such rules protected consumers but also disciplined sellers, especially women whose sales blurred household and public economies. A woman selling pies from a back door might be tolerated at dawn, but fined at the market bell if accused of undercutting guild bakers. Hygiene is a modern lens, but medieval people had pragmatic practices. They understood spoilage, smoke, and vinegar's preservative power. Households threw out rotten meat and feared tainted water. Public health measures were crude: waste removal, regulations on slaughterhouses, and ordinances against dumping in the river. But they reveal practical knowledge about risk. Midwives and healers overlap with kitchen knowledge. Certain herbs steeped into broths for fevers, particular porridge recipes recommended for convalescence, and poultices made from kitchen plants applied for wounds. Women's roles as food producers gave them social standing. A cook at a wealthy household managed servants, ordered provisions, and made seasonal plans. A vendor at the market assembled credit networks by letting neighbors take food on trust. An innkeeper's wife could shape news and reputation through hospitality. Food work was visible work. Consumers tasted it, neighbors discussed it, civic officers could sue or fine over it. That visibility made women culinary authorities in their neighborhoods. Yet the labor is also exhaustive and gendered. The kitchen demands long hours, heavy lifting, and perpetual attention to timing. Breads must be stoked, pots stirred, spits turned. Women who combined bread, dairy, brewing, and stall sales carried interlocking shifts that stretched from before dawn until after dusk. Pregnancy and child rearing added further constraints, yet many households adapted. Older children wound skeins or fetched water, neighbors swapped childcare for shared baking shifts, and guilds or confraternities sometimes intervened with charity. Food ties into credit and ritual. A woman's bread might be pledged for a loan, a neighbor's ale might be repaid with a portion of butter. Festivals reorder kitchen life. Christmas and Saints' Days demand special pies and larger roasts. Lent reduces meat and increases fish trade, reshaping gendered labor in both kitchens and quays. Food also carries symbolism: a dowry's embroidered tablecloth, the wedding feast's roast, the communal bread at a funeral. These edible practices encode memory, obligation, and social rank. Late in the afternoon, a market inspector walks the rows. At one stall, he pauses over a woman who has been selling small pastry pockets at unusual hours. A complaint has been made by the Bakers' Guild. The inspector's pen will soon cross parchment, and the woman may find herself summoned to court, forced to justify measure, recipe, and place in the market's ordering. The outcome will determine not just a single sale, but the boundary between household survival and regulated commerce. The house where a birth is called is half sanctum, half workshop. Linen folded on a chest, a brass pot warming on the hearth, bundles of herbs hanging from a rafter, and a stool set ready for a tired back. The smell is a strange comfort: sweet fennel, dried rue, laudanum of clove and wine when it is used, the iron quiet of clean water warmed on the stove. Women move with careful economy. A midwife loosens a band, adjusts a blanket, murmurs a line she has used for years. A newborn's cry is the room's verdict. A mother's first breath is a small public miracle that ripples through neighbors and kin. Midwives occupy an ambiguous civic position. Their skill is intimate and embodied, learned by apprenticeship and observation, and their authority is rooted in the daily economy of care. In towns and villages across Europe, they are the primary attendants at birth, cutting the cord, assisting the presenting limb, applying compresses, and advising on postnatal diet and hygiene. Their knowledge spans practical obstetrics and a suite of household remedies: which herbs reduce bleeding, how to make poultices for infection, and which broths restore a mother's strength. That knowledge travels by demonstration and memory rather than by printed manuals. The social value of a good midwife is enormous. A reliable attendant brings more than clinical competence. She brings confidentiality, calm, and a network of neighbors willing to fetch clean linen, watch toddlers, or bring broth at dawn. Midwives often function as community caseworkers, arranging foster care for an infant in emergency, standing as witnesses in baptismal registers, or mediating disputes about paternity or dowry when births complicate household economies. For this reason, midwives' reputations are a kind of currency, praised, recommended, and sometimes memorialized in wills as trusted servants whose work kept families functioning. Regulation around midwifery is complex and historically variable. In some towns, ecclesiastical authorities kept close watch. Parishes required midwives to swear oaths. to testify in church courts about births or newborn survival, and sometimes to produce witness lists for baptisms. Municipal authorities inspected measures and public markets, but left much clinical authority to clergy and to custom. In other locales, civic ordinances required midwives to register or to be examined by a group of elders and experienced practitioners. Procedures meant to protect mothers, but also to impose normative standards. Where male-dominated medical institutions gained strength, tensions grew. Surgeon guilds and learned physicians sometimes argued that certain difficult cases required man midwives or surgical intervention, a shift that intensified in some regions between the 17th and 18th centuries. Healers overlap with midwives in practice and in controversy. Women who prepared simples, single-ingredient remedies, taught neighbors how to poultice a wound with boiled comfrey, which herbs eased a fever, or how to prepare a sitz bath for a mother. These remedies derived from a mixed intellectual heritage: folklore, Dioscoridean plant knowledge filtered through monastic herbals, and hands-on trial. The science is tactile, a compress is warmth, the soothing texture of plant mucilage, the timing of a fomentation. Healers are careful with language, moderate the fever, stop the bleeding, because the line between care and harm is thin, and because legal scrutiny could turn a badly timed remedy into grounds for accusation. Legal risk shadowed such work. Where a birth went badly, a midwife might face inquiry, called to testify before a parish or municipal court, asked to recount the sequence of events, and to call the neighbors who were present. In times and places of heightened fear, disease outbreaks, famine, or moral panic, midwives and herbalists sometimes became targets for suspicion. Accusations could travel from negligence to malice. Historians find records of ecclesiastical investigations and, in extreme early modern episodes, witchcraft trials where women practicing medicinal arts were implicated. Yet these dramatic cases should not obscure the ordinary face of midwifery. Most work proceeded without spectacle, embedded in reciprocal neighborly exchange. Training is oral and practical. A young woman learned by sitting in a birthing room, holding a mother's hand, passing warmed cloths, learning how to coax a presenting shoulder back into position, or to advise on breathing rhythms. Apprenticeship could take years and involve reading local remedies aloud from a household copy of a monastic herbary if one was available. The most valuable lessons are tactile: the feel of a contracting uterus, the softening of tissues, the way a limb which is difficult to rotate demands particular maneuvers learned by experience. Midwives also learn to judge when to call for extra hands, when a neighbor's strength is needed to pull a mother upright, or when a surgeon's splinting skill is required. Midwifery also carries economic dimensions. Fees vary widely. In prosperous towns, a midwife might be paid coin, a set of linens, or a portion of the bride's trousseau for services rendered. Elsewhere, payment is in kind: eggs, bread, or seasonal labor. Some midwives built informal credit lines, lending a helping hand now to assure a neighbor's favor and labor later. Widows who served as midwives combined the income with other small enterprises, selling herbal remedies, brewing light ale for convalescents, or mending linens, to sustain households, bridging health work with the market's needs. Ethics and secrecy matter. Midwives often stood at the intersection of intimate knowledge and public consequence. They knew birth's timing, mothers' private circumstances, and sometimes the hints of contested paternity. Confidentiality is thus central to trust. In parish courts, a midwife's sworn testimony might weigh decisively in disputes. Her discretion protects households. Her betrayal can destroy reputations. This moral economy, pledges of secrecy, reciprocal favors, and careful witness choices, structures the practice as much as the technical skill. Technologies and cultural change alter midwifery's shape over time. The rise of licensed male surgeons and the growth of institutional hospitals in later centuries professionalized some forms of obstetrics and shifted complicated surgical births out of household settings. Yet in most of the medieval and early modern city, the midwife remained the primary actor at birth. The tension between domestic, embodied care, and professionalized, male-led medicine marks a major seam in women's medical histories. As dusk deepens, a midwife finishes stitching a repaired perineal tear and writes a short note for the mother's record. At the street corner, a cart arrives bearing a woman in labor from the poorer lanes. Breeches mud-splashed, shrieks heard even over the wheels creak. The midwife gathers her herbs, a warmed bowl, and a small lamp. What she finds in that house will test not only her skill, but the fragile networks of help the town provides. Dawn at a fair changes the countryside into a temporary city. Tents ring the green, cartwheels sink into soft soil, smoke curls from spit roasts, and the air carries the mingled scents of spices, tar, and warm leather. Merchants open trunks and unfurl cloth. Women lift wicker baskets to show cheeses and eggs. Itinerant sellers mount small stands and shout their wares. A fair condenses many markets into a single pulse where goods, credit, and news move faster than in ordinary lanes. Fairs follow a seasonal rhythm built into church and agrarian calendars. They gather people at harvest, on a saint's feast, and at the end of pilgrimage seasons so that dispersed producers can reach clustered buyers. For household producers, this concentration matters. A widow can sell remaining dowry cloth, a spinner can convert skeins into cash, and a village woman can reach urban buyers who will pay prices unavailable at the local gate. The seasonality also means a fair shapes household planning, grain set aside for market, cloth finished by a given date, and apprentices' schedules arranged to match the fair's week. The social map of a fair is layered and gendered. Chartered merchants and their factors move large bales, negotiate contracts, and hire packmen. Drapers and tented retailers display bolts and samples for buyers seeking better fabrics. Interwoven among these formal layers are peddlers and hawkers who carry small goods on poles, alewives who erect temporary drinking booths, and women selling pies, eggs, butter, and household processed textiles from wicker baskets. Women frequently dominate the retail tier and the sale of household processed goods, but they also appear as mobile peddlers traveling between fairs. Law and revenue shape how a fair operates. Lords and towns issued charters that fixed the right to host a fair and determined which tolls were due. Officers collected stall rents, inspected weights and measures, and sometimes enforced customs duties on imported goods. A charter made a fair a site for recognized contracts and credit, but enforcement proved uneven. The rush of bodies, the temporary nature of stalls, and the distance from municipal centers meant that surveillance was patchy and opportunism could flourish. Credit and contract take distinctive forms at fairs. Large merchants often used bills of exchange to move credit without carrying coin across dangerous roads. Factors issued receipts and advanced funds against future cargoes. Smaller sellers relied on immediate cash, short-term trust, and pawning. A dyer might accept a pawned brooch against a bolt of cloth. A baker might extend a small tab to a regular buyer until the next fair. These informal financial practices knitted household economies into larger market networks and helped smooth seasonal volatility. The fair is a sensory theater. You hear the metallic ring of measures, the slap of a cloak as cloth is fanned to display weave and color, the rattle of wooden boxes, and the low murmur of bargaining. Visual display matters. Dyes are shown wide to catch the light, spices are arranged in small glass vials to signal rarity, and jewelry is spread on white linen to reflect the sun. Smell functions as reputation. The smoke and salt of a fish stall promises immediate freshness, while an overpowering scent may betray spoilage. Women who mastered display, who folded cloth to reveal selvages, who arranged cheeses to showcase rind and texture, use sensory skill as economic leverage. Concentration invites conflict. Theft between tents, dishonest assistance, and disputes over measure and quality are constant threats. Mounted watchmen and market officers patrol main lanes but cannot prevent all wrongdoing. Sellers of perishable goods face weather as enemy. Rain soaks unsheltered wares, mud impedes carts, and sudden frost destroys produce destined for lean months. Cooperative strategies reduce risk. Women share stalls, pool the cost of covered space, rotate night watches, and offer mutual aid so that a stolen hamper or a spoiled vat does not collapse a household's year. Fairs are also information hubs. Minstrels and storytellers attract crowds and carry news from region to region. Innkeepers and alewives listen and transmit intelligence about river obstructions, embargoes, or a ship detained in port. Such news alters commerce immediately. A rumor of seized wool depresses prices. A report of a rich harvest increases supply. Women who ran inns or drinking booths sat at the center of these exchanges and therefore had a measure of influence over what goods were in demand and how prices moved. Women's mobility at fairs matters. Some travel as partners or employees of merchants. Others act as independent peddlers, buying small wares to sell across seasons. Widows use fairs tactically to convert household goods into capital, to settle debts, or to acquire seed and cloth for the coming year. Mobility brings opportunity, but also exposure to theft, exhaustion, and unfamiliar legal contexts. Yet records show many women moving with practiced efficiency, negotiating stalls and paperwork, and returning home with what the household needs. As the sun tilts west, a customs officer steps to a tent where a merchant has opened a sealed chest of imported cloth. The officer reads the declaration, compares it to the sample, and computes the duty owed. A local draper in the crowd points to a discrepancy in the description. Buyers lean forward to inspect color and finish. The town clerk fetches a pen to copy the manifest. The crowd, the merchant, and the official all hold their breath. The outcome of this inspection will determine who pays, who profits, and whether a routine market day will turn into a recorded dispute that apprentices, wives, and widows will remember for months. You step into a narrow yard where boys and girls, lads and maidens, move under a master's eye. The air smells of hemp and oil, leather and hot metal, the sharp tang of dye stone, and the warm sweetness of oiled wood. Tools clack and hands repeat small motions. A shuttle through a shed, a pair of scissors opening and closing, a bobbin wound and set. Apprenticeship is the town's method for turning household skill into reproducible craft, and it is where private instruction meets public authority. Apprenticeship is a contract as much as a pedagogy. Across late medieval and early modern Europe, the typical arrangement bound a young person to a master for a set term, the familiar 7 years in many places, during which the apprentice received board, lodging, instruction, and sometimes garments or livery. The families paid a premium or dowry to secure a place. In return, the master promised to teach the trade and not to send the child into dangerous labor. Notarial rolls and guild registers are full of these indentures: names, durations, conditions, and witness signatures. They are legal documents because a craft's reproduction mattered to guilds and civic authorities alike. The daily rhythm of training is mundane and intense. Mornings begin with sweeping and fetching water. Apprentices clean tools, warm hearths, and prepare materials before they are allowed the more delicate work. Skills accrete slowly. The earliest tasks are menial: winding thread, mending rags, carrying full buckets. But they teach attention, responsibility, and the body's economy. Gradually, the apprentice gets finer tasks. A girl may start hemming simple garments and progress to embroidered panels. A boy may learn to warp a loom and then to set a complex pattern. Mastery is judged by touch and eye rather than exam. A correctly tensioned warp, a seam that lies flat, a die that takes evenly. Gender maps onto training in predictable and surprising ways. Many guilds preferred male apprentices for public crafts like carpentry, smithing, or fulling, yet women learned trades through household roots, daughters instructed by mothers, cousins, and neighbors. Girls were often bound as servants, with the tacit understanding they would learn a craft. Sometimes they were formally apprenticed in tasks such as sewing, embroidery, millinery, brewing, or midwifery-related trades. In towns with large textile industries, women appear in records as bound apprentices for finishing and needlework. The legal form could obscure the reality. A girl bound as a servant might, in practice, receive the same technical instruction as a boy apprentice. Discipline is part of the pedagogy. Masters exercised authority backed by both contract and social expectation. Apprenticement carried obligations. The apprentice had to obey, refrain from marriage during the term, in many places, and perform tasks without wage claims. Masters promised instruction and maintenance. Breaking either side's covenant could lead to municipal intervention. Corporal punishment and fines appear in guild ordinances and court records. A repeating absentee might be flogged or fined. A runaway apprentice could be pursued and returned. A master who failed to teach properly could be sued for damages. These mechanisms enforced stability, but also produced resentment and resistance. The social world of training extends beyond the master's shop. Apprentices live in the household. They share meals, sleep under the same roof, and learn domestic labor as part of their trade. This arrangement blurs economic and familial ties. A boy becomes part of a household's labor budget, and a girl's training often overlaps with domestic service. Apprentices socialize together, playing, singing, and asking favors, forming networks that persist into journeymanhood or marriage. These friendships are also safety valves. Apprentices swap tips, warn one another about abusive masters, and sometimes plan collective action when conditions are intolerable. Journeymen and mobility form the second stage of training. After their term, apprentices hope to become journeymen, paid craftspeople who travel to broaden skill, seek better wages, or fulfill the guild rule that journeymen work for a time before gaining mastery. The road shaped technique and taste. A journeyman who worked in different towns learned regional styles, new dye recipes, and different measurement standards. For women, mobility was more constrained but not absent. Some women traveled with merchant households, married journeymen who brought new techniques, or moved between towns as specialist needleworkers or embroiderers. Economic barriers were real. The final leap to mastership often required a masterpiece to demonstrate skill and a purse to pay entrance fees, rent a shop, and perhaps buy a loom or forge. Many apprentices never reached that stage. They remained journeymen or returned to household labor. For women, the barriers could be higher. Guilds sometimes forbade female masters, and the capital required to open a workshop was frequently beyond a widow's or unmarried woman's reach. Yet resourceful women used other levers, marriage into a master's household, taking over a late husband's business, or operating on the margins as independent seamstresses and peddlers. Apprenticeship also functions as a social filter. Families chose placements carefully. A reputable master could secure a child's future. A shabby workshop might mean hard labor, limited instruction, and little chance of advancement. Parents negotiated apprenticeships as investments, considering the master's reputation, the neighborhood's safety, and the kinds of clients the shop served. Confraternities and guild charities sometimes subsidized poor children's placements or provided dowries for girls who could not otherwise find good matches. Conflict and negotiation puncture the idyll. Disputes over diet, delays in instruction, sexual misconduct, or fees brought apprentices to municipal courts. Runaways were a common and telling phenomenon. A bound child who fled a cruel master forced civic authorities and guilds to reconsider enforcement practices. A notorious case in any town could provoke guild debates about inspection and reform. Should apprenticeships be more regulated? Should masters be certified more strictly? Would boards of inspection prevent abuse? These debates reflect how apprenticeship is both technical training and a site of social governance. At dusk, a young bound hand, neither boy nor girl wholly formed into craft, practices a seam that will determine whether she is kept on beyond the term. Outside the door, a petition is being drafted. Several apprentices intend to demand better bread and lighter hours. The petition's existence suggests a seam has been pulled too tight, tensions that will bring minor grievances into public view and may force guilds and magistrates to decide whose obligation matters more, the master's power or the apprentice's right to decent training. A quay is where languages meet, because cloth, spice, and coin demand conversation. Ships that creak into harbor bring cargo, techniques, tastes, and people shaped by other shores. For the marketwoman, cross-cultural exchange is immediate. The arrival of a dye she has not seen, a bolt of silk with a new selve edge, a recipe scribbled on the margin of a merchant's note, or a pilgrim's description of a festival where garments hang in unfamiliar colorways. Ports are theaters of invention. Venetian and Genoese galleys, Catalan cogs, and Hanseatic hulks threaded different seas and deposited goods at the same wharf. Spices that sharpen bland diets, saffron that stains cloth, a brilliant red, alum and sumac for fixing dyes, and silk that sets price tiers apart. These materials change local crafts. Dyers learn new vat chemistry, embroiderers adopt couching techniques for imported threads, tailors alter cut and drape to suit lighter, more fluid fabrics. Each fresh arrival invites experimentation and forces artisans to relearn touch. Cross-cultural transfer is tactile and exacting. A dyer who once relied on woad accepts a sample of madder, grinds roots by hand, and learns which mordant produces a stable red. She tests strips of cloth until the hue survives rain and washing. A seamstress working silk changes needle size, lengthens stitches, and shows an apprentice how to draw thread without puckering a seam. An alewife offered sacks of imported hops, adjusts boil times and fermentation to balance bitterness and preservation. These experiments are messy, costly, and communal, performed in back rooms and judged by neighbors' tongues and buyers' eyes. Diasporic and migrant networks mediate much of this exchange. Jewish, Muslim, and other itinerant merchants and artisans operate as brokers of both goods and technical knowledge. In many port towns, these households run shops and warehouses and translate mercantile terms into practice. Women in these communities sell spices, prepare specialized provisions, and work in textile finishing. When neighbors borrow a spice or a dye recipe, knowledge moves quietly across kitchens and lanes. The diffusion is not always linear. Recipes are adapted, ingredients substituted, and localized variants invented that feel both foreign and familiar. Pilgrimage and military travel also move objects and ideas. Pilgrims return with reliquary cloths and souvenirs that inspire imitation. Soldiers and envoys bring back fabrics and tastes from the Eastern Mediterranean that alter elite wardrobes and liturgical display. Convents and monasteries participate too. Nuns cultivate medicinal plants, copy recipes into conventual books, and order imported spices for infirmaries and feasts. Monastic inventories record exotic jars and costly textiles, showing that sacred institutions were part of the same web that braided local and foreign goods. Municipal law shapes how foreign wares are received. Sumptuary statutes attempt to regulate who may wear silks or particular colors, policing rank and curbing ostentation. Enforcement is uneven, and fashion leaks downward despite regulation. A peasant bride might not be permitted a brocaded petticoat, yet a small scrap of Eastern silk folded into her trousseau, or an embroidered hem that echoes elite motifs transmits taste across social lines. Craftspeople translate foreign motifs into local idioms, producing hybrid objects that combine imported prestige with regional materials and meanings. Language and technique migrate together. Merchant ledgers carry foreign names: alumin, indigo, kermes, and those words enter a dyer's working vocabulary as instruction. Women who dye, stitch, and sell convert written or spoken labels into embodied practice. A foreign term becomes a household recipe. A Moorish weave becomes a local stitch. Learning happens by demonstration and repetition. One does not need formal literacy to master a recipe's sensations: how a vat should smell, how a thread should slide through the fingers, how a seam must hold under tension. Exchange brings opportunity and hazard in equal measure. A new dye can be a boon. A widow who masters a superior mordant raises the value of her cloth and can repay loans. But a cheap imported pigment that fades will ruin the collateral she pledged at a pawnbroker and force her to forfeit goods. Merchants with privileged access to long-distance trade can undercut local producers, pressuring household workshops to compete at thin margins. Authorities may respond with tariffs, inspections, or bans meant to protect domestic industry. Such interventions reallocate advantage toward capital-rich traders and away from household-based labor. Women, in practice, are frequent translators of value. They judge whether an imported scarf is worth a barter of eggs and a week's labor. They decide whether exotic dye will pay back the cost of the root. They teach apprentices the stitch that turns imitation into tasteful variation rather than a sham. Through these everyday assessments, global flows condense into local economies and into moral judgments about taste, authenticity, and prudence. Objects tell the story of this movement. A scrap of Eastern silk opened in a noblewoman's parlor becomes a template in a regional workshop. A jar of imported spice passed into a household transforms festive cooking and becomes a local flavor. A dyer who masters a foreign mordant commands higher prices and teaches neighbors, reshaping the town's industry. Small transmissions accumulate. A new color may become a town's signature. A borrowed motif may define a bride's trousseau for a generation. Bodies on the move carry the most intimate knowledge. Merchant wives, refugee artisans, and pilgrim companions bring procedural memory: how to prepare a dye, how to couch an imported thread, how to dry herbs on a rafter beam. When such people settle or find hospitality, host households absorb these methods and reconfigure who holds craft capital in the neighborhood. As dusk falls on the quay, a crier announces that a ship laden with Eastern silks was delayed by storm and will be put up for auction at sunrise. Dyers, seamstresses, and shopwomen crowd the warehouses. Will the delay raise prices and reward those with credit, or will it mean spoilage and loss for small sellers? The decision to bid, to pool resources, or to innovate a cheaper local substitute will determine who profits and who must adapt, a choice that will echo in guild minutes and family ledgers for years. The courthouse is colder than the market. Stone steps slope down to a vaulted room, where a single high window throws a thin band of light across a long table. Ink sits in pots like dark wells, quills dry with a brittle whisper. A clerk in a somber hood rearranges parchment stamped with wax. The air smells faintly of tallow and damp vellum. Legal language is a kind of architecture here. Writs, rolls, chirographs, built to convert messy life into enforceable lines. For women whose work often hummed in kitchens and yards, these documents are both danger and salvation, the place where private labor becomes public fact. Disputes arrive through small things: a complaint about short wait at a market stall, a widow contested for property by a brother-in-law, an apprentice's complaint of abuse, a pawnbroker's claim of unredeemed goods. Each summons opens a drama. The plaintiff's breath quickens. A defendant smooths a skirt. Neighbors gather in doorway clusters as if a play is about to begin. Town courts, guild courts, market courts, and manorial sessions handle the routine commerce of urban life. More serious matters travel upward. Pleas to higher chambers, appeals to city councils, or petitions to ecclesiastical courts when marriage, wills, or moral questions are involved. The first legal instrument many women encounter is a simple summons, a parchment bearing a clerk's hand, a date, and a place. The summons commands a presence at a specified hour. Attendance matters. Default can mean judgment in one's absence and the seizure of goods. So a woman tucks her ledger beneath her cloak and crosses the lane, each step counting toward a public reckoning. In the hall, she will swear an oath, call witnesses, and maybe hand over a written inventory. Pages listing linen, pewter, bolts of cloth, and the marks that prove ownership. Notarial acts are crucial. Notaries recorded pledges, debts, and dowries. They sealed chirographs. Documents split so each party kept a copy that could be fitted together to show authenticity. A notary's register is an autobiographical map of bargaining. Who advanced wool to whom? Who pledged silver for a loan? Who promised to finish a bolt by Michaelmas? For women, these recorded acts make private bargains legible to courts. When a widow's right to a house is disputed, a surviving notarial inventory or a witness's oath can tip the scales. Evidence is a theater of touch and testimony. A midwife's reputation is proved not by lab-grown data, but by neighbors' testimony, a line of women who will swear to the competence that saved a child. A dyer's honesty may be defended by the smell and color of an undyed sample tucked away in a chest, or by the oath of an apprentice who recalls a successful vat. Courts accepted such embodied knowledge as admissible. Witnesses described color, texture, smell, and skill as reliably as they described coin. The court's work is to translate these senses into judgment. Procedural forms vary by form. Guild courts adjudicate craft offenses, short measure, unauthorized selling, broken oaths, often with fines, public penance, or temporary suspensions. Market and manor courts enforce local customs, registration of weights and measures, the return of stray beasts, or fines for dumping. City councils and superior courts handle larger disputes, property conveyance, commercial litigation across towns, or petitions against abusive officials. Ecclesiastical courts govern marriage contracts, wills, and moral complaints. Their records brim with matrimonial disputes, dowry claims, and petitions of charity. Documents particularly relevant where women's household property and honor intersect. Inventories are both practical lists and narratives. When a woman appears in court claiming dower or defending against creditor seizure, she may present an inventory, a room-by-room account of chests, linens, kitchenware, loaves, and tools. These lists read like intimate economic biographies. They reveal what household labor mattered: spinning wheels, dyeing pots, kettles still blackened by years of brewing. An inventory may secure a widow's life interest in goods. It may also reveal liabilities, debts noted in margin, pledges recorded against a chest. For historians, these inventories are a key to reconstructing the texture of female labor. Signatures and marks also matter. Many women were illiterate. They made their mark or used a personal seal, a looped symbol pressed into wax. Seals authenticate and dignify. A woman who seals a document claims legal identity. In some towns, municipal officials required specific marks on inventories to prevent fraud. A seal is not merely bureaucratic. It is an assertion. I am here, I signed, I stake my reputation. That simple act could protect the dowry chest from seizure or allow a widow to collect rents owed to her late husband. Conflict unfolds slowly and theatrically. A guildmaster accuses a seamstress of selling under guild rates. The seamstress calls witnesses: a mother who bought cloth last week, an apprentice who worked the seam. A notary's receipt for an advance payment appears. The guild convenes, fines are debated, and the town clerk enters the result into the roll. Sometimes the verdict favors the woman. Sometimes it confirms the guild's authority. Regardless, the record enters the municipal memory, a line on a roll that will shape market behavior and teach neighbors where formal boundaries lie. The law can also be a tool for leverage. Women use suits to collect unpaid debts, to enforce dowry settlements, or to claim rental income. A widow petitioning for dower will deploy witnesses, notarial notes, and inventories. She may also call on a confraternity to guarantee character. Suits are costly in attention and time, but victory could secure years of income and independence. Hence, women litigated, reluctantly, often, but strategically. Judgment scenes can escalate. When a pawnbroker refuses to release a pledged ring, a bailiff may inventory goods at dawn. Chests will be opened, cloth examined, and neighbors instructed to bear witness. Public sale follows if redemption fails. The community watches, pity, judgment, and gossip circulate. Legal outcomes are not merely economic. They shape honor, marriage prospects, and social standing. As afternoon light slants through the courthouse grill, a new case is entered. A group of women petition to reclaim a parcel of cloth seized by a factor after a shipment was delayed at sea. The clerk unfurls a shipping receipt. Ink faded, seal cracked, and the room holds its breath. The factor insists the goods are collateral for unpaid advances. The women insist the goods were finished and paid for. The judge calls for witnesses and the notaries register. The next hours will test the seam where private labor and public law meet, whether a mother's spun skeins remain hers, or whether a ledger's line will take them away. The city keeps secrets in its attics, alleyways, and the narrow rooms above bakeries. Closed shutters hide hands at work. A lantern's circle reveals a table where bobbins slip and twist, where a woman draws a needle through silk until the thread sings. Hidden crafts are not grand industries but delicate economies, small scale, often domestic, and crucial to how people dressed, smelled, and moved through the town. These crafts feed vanity and need alike: a trimmed hood for a merchant's wife, a straw hat for a harvest, a tiny comb carved from bone for a bride's hair. Begin at the lace room. Bobbin lace, needle lace, or simple netting appears in different places and centuries, but the principle is similar: repetition, patience, and 1,000 small motions. A lace maker pins a pricked pattern to a pillow and crosses bobbins in a choreography that makes fabric out of empty space. The room smells faintly of starch and beeswax used to stiffen the patterns. Lace is a luxury that migrates upward in value. A neat edging can turn a common cap into a fashionable headpiece. Women who mastered lace supplied merchants, convents, and wealthy households. Their work traveled far beyond the alley in which they sat. Needlework, embroidery, goldwork, and stump work transforms fabric and status. An embroidered panel tells a story: saints stitched into an altar frontal, a hunting scene on a nobleman's coif, a floral repeat edging a dowry sheet. Techniques differ: split stitch, chain, couching for metallic thread. Work of this kind required fine eyes and steady hands. Apprentices, often girls, learned through imitation and repetition, guided by older women who guarded patterns like recipes. Embroidery workshops could be attached to noble households, convents, or urban ateliers where commissions arrived from merchants or traveling patrons. Millinery and trimmings, passementerie, fringes, braids, and tassels are small crafts that alter garments' meaning. A braid of gilt thread sewn along a hem signals rank. A fringe lengthens the silhouette and hides a seam. Passementières produce complex ornamental cords. Their materials, silk, metal thread, beads, often came through merchant networks. Women made and sold such trimmings from stalls or supplied drapers, who then affixed them to garments. The hands that knot and plait these small items work with a keen sense of fashion, timing, and color harmony. Comb and bonework lie between craft and curiosity. Combs carved from bone, boxes inlaid with mother of pearl, pins hammered from fine metal. These objects are small, portable, and often unrecorded in guild minutes. They lived in women's drawers and were practical. Combs detangled, pins held veils. Small mirrors dressed faces. The craft used materials that were locally available, bone, horn, and required precise cutting, scraping, and polishing. Women practiced such arts in back rooms or near hearths, their tools modest but precise. Scrapers, files, and heated sand for shaping. Knitting and netting are textile labs of another order. A knitter sits in a household corner, needles clicking, producing stockings, caps, and small garments that keep a town warm. Knitting was portable, flexible, and adaptable to small-scale sale. Women often knitted to supplement household incomes, selling stockings or mittens at markets or fairs. Nets, fishing, or decorative, were made with similar repetitive patience. The choreography of hands and needle is audible, a soft click, a hiss of yarn, a practiced slide that marks experience rather than instruction. Soap and candle making live at the edge where household necessity meets market trade. Women rendered fat into tallow, mixed it with ashes and lye, and produced soap for laundry and leatherwork. Candle making, chandlery, was sometimes guild-regulated, but household candles were essential. Women dipped wicks or molded tallow in simple forms. These processes are chemical in practice. Heat, fat, alkali worked in controlled sequences. Smells of lye, char, and burnt fat are honest markers of this hidden labor. Hidden crafts also include repair and recycling, mending, patching, and reworking objects until they can travel another season. A seamstress takes apart a worn garment, carefully unstitches, and repurposes cloth into aprons or linings. A cobbler's wife may resew soles or patch uppers at home, retreading leather with patience. These repairs are the town's sustainability system, extending the useful life of goods and keeping small margins viable. Demand shapes these crafts. Fashion drives them upward. Crowns of pearls, edge sleeves, new hemlines. That is where small workshops grow. A sudden court fashion, an embroidered cuff, or a new braid creates a rush. Women work nights to produce the trimming that will sell at the next fair. But demand also falters. A sudden tariff, a war that interrupts trade routes, or a depressed harvest that tightens household spending shrinks markets. Hidden craftsmen respond with flexibility, downscaling orders, offering simpler variants, or combining ritual work with daily mending. Legal and social pressures press on hidden crafts. Guilds sometimes saw these practices as illicit competition, especially when domestic workers sold items in markets. Municipal officers could fine peddlers or seize unstamped goods. Women navigated these pressures by selling early in the morning, using neighborhood networks to find discreet buyers, or by embedding work within convents and households where protection was stronger. Confraternities and charitable networks sometimes supported small workshops by providing commissions for altar cloths and vestments, publicly sanctioned work that also carried social prestige. Knowledge transmission is organic. Patterns are taught by touch. The apprentice's earliest job is to wind bobbins or hold a pattern steady. The grandmother's stitch becomes canonical by repetition. Women pass recipes for starch, mordants for lacing, and measures for candlewick length, not in manuals but through demonstration. Their craft capital, this embodied, transported know-how, travels with them when they marry, when they accompany a merchant's household, or when they take in a pupil. Hidden crafts matter because they alter what people wear, how they eat, and how they display status. They are economy and culture braided together. A trimmed hem tells a civic story as powerfully as a public procession. In a twilight attic, a woman pins a delicate edging to a bride's veil. Below in the street, a guild officer's boot echoes toward the house. The veil, the lace, the stitched story are all at risk if the officer decides the work breaks guild rules, or if a wealthy patron withdraws a commission in hard times. Tonight, as the needle pauses above the silk, a knock sounds on the door, an unexpected visitor bearing a sealed warrant. Morning at the market opens with practical music. Sellers call measures, children chant for coins, and women hum as they work to keep the rhythm of endless tasks. These sounds are not ornament, they are instruments of memory and measurement. Songs keep time for spinning and washing. Counting rhymes help a fishwife tally herring while her hands remain busy. A shared refrain on a long workday sustains pace and signals solidarity. Across towns and seasons, oral forms transmit technique and local news. Work songs take many shapes. A spinner's chant repeats a short line to mark a spindle's turn. Fullers drum a rhythm to time the beating of cloth. Bakers intone a verse as dough rises on trays. These sonic practices are functional. Rhythm coordinates collective action, reduces error, and folds sociality into labor. A song also marks belonging. When a woman recognizes a local melody, she knows which neighborhood or patronage the singer belongs to. When a chorus answers a call, neighbors affirm mutual ties. Gossip is another kind of social music. Informal, brisk, and politically potent. Market lanes are rumor mills. A whispered accusation about a short-weight seller can empty a stall as fast as an official fine. Praise spreads a reputation that brings repeat customers. Gossip circulates creditworthiness. If a neighbor whispers that a woman has taken too many loans without repaying, lenders tighten their terms. If a seamstress is praised for even hems, merchants bring larger orders. In this crowded economy, words alter markets as decisively as ledgers. Debt and credit live at the heart of this soundscape. A written note binds in court, but a remembered promise binds in the lane. Many transactions depend on reputation rather than sealed documents. A baker remembers who borrowed grain last harvest. An alewife remembers who paid late 3 seasons ago. In some places, wooden tallies or knotted cords recorded obligations. In others, receipts and notarial notes served as written backup. Both systems worked alongside gossip to keep households afloat between markets. When reputation frays, enforcement follows. Municipal courts and guild tribunals call witnesses and require inventories. Public penance, fines, and seizures answer default. For small sellers, the consequences are visible and immediate. A seized chest of cloth may be cataloged in a market roll and displayed as forfeited goods. A tavern's license might be suspended. These penalties are economic and social. They warn neighbors and reshape trust. A single public sanction can turn a once trusted vendor into a risky debtor overnight. Enforcement itself is social theater. A debtor might come to court flanked by neighbors willing to vouch, offering testimony that stabilizes credit. A guild may mediate a settlement to avoid scandal. A confraternity might underwrite a repayment to protect a member's honor. These interventions show that law and gossip are braided practices. Formal penalties derive force from social memory, and rumor gains weight because institutions can act on it. Market governance is therefore as much relational as it is procedural. Music and rumor also carry news. Before modern printing, criers, minstrels, and market chatter announced seizures, edicts, and dangers, so the town learned as fast as the hall did. A spinning circle can become a bulletin board, a line added to a verse, "The ships are late," moves through neighborhoods, and alters buying decisions. Oral exchange functions as a rapid response system for commerce, turning private labor into civic information. This adaptiveness has costs. Rumor is fast but error-prone. Slander can destroy a woman's credit or marriage prospects. Courts sometimes hear cases not only over money, but over reputation. Libel suits where a woman seeks redress for damaging gossip, or prosecutions for slander that harm trade. Legal remedies exist, but they are slow and costly. Meanwhile, gossip moves at market speed. So, women develop tactics, cultivating allies who will testify on their behalf, hosting small gatherings where goods and virtue can be shown together, and trading discreetly with a trusted circle to reduce exposure. Songs and gossip are also memory technologies. Lullabies, work refrains, and kitchen jokes encode technique. A rhyme tells when to add lye to soap. A verse recalls which madder bath yielded the truest red last summer. And a refrain names a reliable factor in the port. These oral forms are cultural capital in a world where books are scarce and apprenticeship informal. A woman who can hum the right recipe or recall the correct sequence is more likely to reproduce a successful vat because craft depends on touch, timing, and local know-how. In moments of crisis, the market's soundscape hardens into collective judgment. Imagine a foreign shipment suspected of fraud. Merchants argue, buyers hiss, and women who sold the cloth feel whispers turn into pointed fingers. Meetings convene. Petitions are drafted. Alliances form on both sides. The market becomes a tribunal in miniature, where gossip fuels legal action and judicial outcomes reshape rumor. The weave of social sound and civic paper holds or tears in those moments. A hush follows, as if the market itself is holding its breath. The next morning, the market bell will sound, and magistrates may record complaints. The young woman's fate will hinge on neighbors' memories and a clerk's signature. At the alewife's booth, a knot of townspeople forms when a young woman is accused of spreading a rumor that an influential draper used false dye. Her basket sits abandoned. The alley seems to lean in toward her. Neighbors exchange low voices, some ready to vouch, others waiting for proof. The drum of gossip has already done damage. Now the market will ask whether social memory will protect her credit or unravel it entirely. Light moves across the city in a different rhythm now. The alleys that once smelled mainly of hearth and wool also carry the sour tang of tannery pits, the metallic note of iron hinges, and the papery scent of broadsheets nailed to gateposts. Change is braided, an accumulation of new tools, legal reforms, and long-distance commerce that slowly rewrites how people work. Women's labor does not disappear in this remaking. It migrates, adapts, and sometimes acquires fresh leverage even as old protections fray. One clear pivot is print and formal record-keeping. The spread of printed notices and rising literacy places municipal proclamations, tariff lists, and market regulations into wider circulation. Where oral contracts and neighborly memory once resolved many small bargains, notarized receipts and written pledges increasingly determine outcomes in civic courts. For many women, this paperwork is ambivalent. A documented receipt can secure a widow's claim to a chest of cloth, while printed regulations and parish registers can extend surveillance into kitchens and stalls and make discretion harder to practice. Long-distance commerce concentrates capital and reshapes production. Ships and caravans bring cloths, spices, and dyes from far ports. Merchants and factors consolidate control of transport and credit. In response, the putting out system spreads in certain regions. Merchants supply raw wool or flax to households and collect finished cloth later. This system can bring cash into more homes, paying spinners, seamstresses, and finishers for piecework. But most of the surplus goes to those who control markets and shipping. Women's labor becomes more monetized, yet the terms of exchange are often set far from the kitchen table. States and parishes reconfigure assistance and oversight. Early modern rulers build standing bureaucracies for war and administration. Customs and excise offices standardize trade while parishes institutionalize poor relief and keep registers of names, debts, and claims. These institutions sometimes provide vital support, bread, lodgings, or alms, yet they also enforce conditions and record dependency. A woman receiving parish relief might secure food for a season, but also face intrusive audits, required labor, or public registration that affects marriageability and local standing. Technological innovation accelerates production changes. Water-powered fulling mills and mechanized hammers take over heavy finishing tasks. Later inventions, the spinning jenny, water frame, and mule, concentrate spinning and carding in workshops and factories. Employers often recruit women and children for repetitive operations because those tasks can be organized at scale and paid at lower rates. For many women, a mill wage brings new purchasing power and a measure of independence. For others, mechanization narrows the kinds of artisan skill that once justified household bargaining. Legal regimes and institutional power rearrange opportunity. Guilds that once regulated standards and sheltered household production decline in influence in many towns as state and capitalist pressures grow. New regulatory frameworks, tariffs, import restrictions, and factory legislation typically privilege those who can invest in machinery and warehouses. Women may find new entry points into wage labor, urban retail, or service trades such as lodging and laundry, yet they also face new exclusions when legal standing, capital, or formal membership becomes a prerequisite for profitable work. Rural transformations send people into towns. Enclosure, privatization of commons, and shifts in land tenure reduce access to grazing and gleaning and push many rural families toward urban wages. Women who once spun and wove as household supplements increasingly seek work as domestic servants, market vendors, or workshop hands. Migration expands kin and patronage networks, but it dissolves customary safety nets. Shared pasture rights and informal reciprocal labor are harder to maintain in the town's crowded lanes, raising household precarity. Consumer culture quickens demand and volatility. Printed pattern books, imported ribbons, and merchant samples make fashions changeable and immediate. Milliners, dressmakers, and trimmers who can respond quickly to new tastes find profitable niches. Those who cannot pivot lose inventory and clients. Sumptuary laws survive in some places as formal attempts to police rank. But as credit and trade broaden access to finer cloth, the enforcement of status through dress becomes both more contested and more porous. Resistance and adaptation continue to shape life. Women form mutual aid societies, sewing schools, and charity bazaars to fund dowries, pay for apprentices, or support the sick. In textile towns, women and children sometimes coordinate strikes, petitions, and protests against wage cuts and unsafe conditions. Parish petitions and local campaigns can nudge municipal authorities toward reform. These collective practices demonstrate practical agency, women pooling labor, credit, and testimony to protect households when structural change bites. The turn toward modernity is therefore neither only loss nor unalloyed progress. It remakes the relationships among household, market, and state in complex ways. Some women lose legal visibility as production migrates from home into wage labor and as property regimes harden. Others gain degrees of economic autonomy through steady wages, migratory networks, or entrepreneurial niches in retail and services. The soundscape of daily life shifts. Hearth smoke mixes with mill steam, hand-spun refrains are joined by the mechanical metronome of machines. The market's tactile economy becomes partly monetized and partly regulated. On a cold, early industrial morning, a line of women forms at the gate of a newly opened textile mill. Some clutch skeins of yarn as bargaining tokens. Others carry household inventories, letters of recommendation, or a child's note. The manager's ledger will decide who is taken on and who must return to the precarious margins of household production. That ledger, inked in a cramped hand, will mark not only wages paid, but the town's slow reweaving of labor across centuries. And the choices made there will echo in kitchens, court rolls, and market stalls for years to come. The market's dust settles in the record, but the work remains. Threads fray, bolts are folded, and objects pass into attics, altars, and storerooms where time preserves them unevenly. The history of women's labor in guilds and markets does not close with a single tidy narrative. It endures in small things: a notary's faint hand on parchment, a dowry inventory tucked into a chest, a convent ledger noting a commission for an altar frontal, or a fragment of hymn rescued from river silt. These fragments are partial but rich. They mark the places where daily work met law, credit, ritual, and family obligation. Memory is both material and social. Material traces, tools, pins, spindle whorls, bobbins, and textile fragments are testimonies to technique and rhythm. Archaeology and conservation science have helped these objects speak. Fiber analysis and dye chemistry identify the plants and minerals that produce particular hues. Textile reconstruction reveals weave patterns and repair practices. When written records are thin, the object itself functions as a document. The pattern of a mend shows what was mended and why, and residue in a dye vat points to trade links, seasonal cycles, and household practices. Social memory travels another way: songs, proverbs, recipes, and gestures. Lullabies timed a spindle's turn. Counting rhymes set a vat's rhythm. Neighborhood reputations underwrote informal credit. In places where apprenticeship was informal and literacy limited, knowledge passed by repetition and example. A mother's thumb on the yarn, a neighbor's whispered recipe for a mordant, and a shared verse that kept a group in time were the real pedagogies of craft. Oral practices held technique and trust in the same breath. Archives contain women too, but finding them requires a sensitive gaze. Notarial registers, court rolls, and guild minutes are framed in male formalities, yet they brim with female traces: a widow's seal, a seamstress named in a dowry, a midwife who appears as witness. Reading against silence is a scholarly practice. Inventories are read like intimate biographies, where 3 skeins of blue yarn stands beside a spinning wheel, and those lines reveal both capacity and need. Piecing these traces together reconstructs networks of exchange and dependence. Who advanced wool? Who finished cloth? Who guaranteed a loan? Public memory reshapes present practice. Museums now place spinning wheels and lace samplers beside portraits and civic records to show that domestic production was economic as well as personal. Conservators painstakingly reconstruct seams, test dyes, and sometimes reveal hidden repairs that testify to reuse and thrift. Community heritage projects revive local patterns and recipes, bringing forgotten techniques back into contemporary life and offering new opportunities for cooperative craft enterprises. Scholarship amplifies quiet labor. Textile historians, social historians, and archaeologists collaborate to read material and documentary records together. Interdisciplinary work, combining chemical analysis of dyes with probate inventories and shipping manifests, traces how raw materials became finished cloth and who accrued value at each stage. Feminist historiography reframes these findings. Household production is not peripheral, but central to urban economies. When a widow's skeins link to a merchant's ledger, private toil emerges as part of wider commercial webs. The legacy is practical as well as intellectual. Contemporary craftspeople revive lace-making, plant-based dyeing, and historic weaving, forming cooperatives and small businesses that honor past techniques while adapting them for modern markets. These revivals are not mere nostalgia. They provide livelihoods, sustain regional identity, and show that careful craft can be economically viable in new forms, through workshops, ethical fashion initiatives, and cultural tourism that respects skill and time. Legal and social echoes persist. Property law, marriage customs, and credit instruments evolved from practices that once allowed widows to run workshops or tied dowries to livelihoods. Understanding those historical precedents helps policymakers and advocates design protections that recognize the economic value of household labor. Debates about unpaid care work, microcredit, and social insurance find useful parallels in the ways communities once used neighborly credit and confraternities to smooth seasonal gaps. There is a moral and human insight at the heart of this recovery. The unseen labor of women in markets and guilds is not an archaeological footnote, but a living contribution to civic life. The meals that fed laborers, the cloth that clothed infants, the stitches that kept a household functioning through hard years. When we lift a fragment of embroidered linen or read a widow's inventory, we meet competence, constraint, and creative adaptation. Recognizing that labor reshapes how we value ordinary work and whom we count as central to economic life. A single archival moment makes this point tangible. In a museum storeroom, a conservator opens an old oak chest and finds, folded in linen, a bundle of brittle threads, a patched cuff, and a small slip of parchment noting a pledge. The ink is faint and the textiles fragile, but together they map a human economy: what was made, how it was used, who kept the accounts, and who bore responsibility. That discovery is not an endpoint. It is the beginning of patient reconstruction. Chemical tests, ledger searches, local oral histories that returns a life to audible range. History does not end with the archive. Its legacies walk among us, in craft schools teaching bobbin lace, in community kitchens feeding neighbors during hard seasons, and in scholarship that insists daily labor deserves historical weight. The economy of a town is stitched from visible markets and invisible labor. Recognizing both changes how we preserve, how we teach skills, and how we honor work in the present. At the open chest, the conservator lifts the patched cuff and reads the tiny slip of parchment aloud. The room, usually full of measured silence, holds its breath. The note is brief. The human story it unlocks will require years of patient work to follow. That labor, archival, chemical, oral, and communal, will reweave fragments into lives and return the ordinary to memory.